My name is Margaret Anderson. I am 72 years old. For most of my life, I believed family was the one thing that could never be taken away from me. I built my home with love. I raised my daughter with everything I had. And when my husband William passed away, I thought the hardest days of my life were already behind me. I was wrong. The person I trusted the most became the person who hurt me the deepest. My own daughter looked at me and saw only an old woman who was no longer capable of making her own decisions. She believed I was weak. She believed I had nothing left to protect. But she never knew the truth about my past. She never knew the secret my husband left behind. And she never imagined that the woman she underestimated would become the person who changed everything. This is the story of betrayal, hidden power, and the moment I finally chose to stand up for myself. Part 1: The woman they stopped respecting. My name is Margaret Anderson. I am 74 years old. For most of my life, people knew me as a wife, a mother, and the woman who kept our family together. I spent 48 years standing beside my husband William through every difficult moment. I watched him build his career. I raised our son Daniel. I protected my family through storms that nobody else ever saw. But after my husband passed away, something changed. Not overnight, not in a way that everyone could notice. It happened slowly. A forgotten phone call, a shorter conversation, a look that lasted only a second too long. At first I told myself I was imagining things. After all, grief changes families, loss changes people. But then my son Daniel started visiting less. And when he did come, he was no longer the same man who used to sit beside me and ask for my advice. He arrived with his wife, Rebecca, a woman who had always been polite in front of others, but behind closed doors I began seeing a different side of her. Rebecca was the kind of person who measured people by what they could provide, their money, their connections, their status. And after my husband died, I realized something painful. In her eyes, I had become invisible. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and Rebecca invited me to dinner at their house. I thought it was a chance to spend time with my family. I wore the blue dress William loved. I brought the pie recipe that Daniel had loved since he was a child. For a moment, I believed things were finally returning to normal. But I was wrong. Halfway through dinner, Rebecca placed her glass down and looked directly at me. "Margaret, we need to talk about your future." I smiled. "What do you mean?" She exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering. "You can't keep living the way you do." I felt my heart tighten. "I've lived in that house for 30 years. Rebecca sighed. "That's exactly the problem." Daniel looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me, he didn't say anything. And somehow that silence hurt more than Rebecca's words. She continued. "You need to accept that you're not the woman you used to be anymore." I stared at her, the woman who had married my son, the woman I had welcomed into my family, the woman I had treated like my own daughter. Then she said the words I would never forget. "You're not someone who makes decisions anymore, Margaret. You're someone we have to take care of." The room became silent. For a moment I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat. I looked at Daniel, hoping he would tell her she was wrong. But my son only whispered, "Moms, maybe Rebecca has a point." That was the moment something inside me changed, not because they underestimated me, but because I finally understood something. They didn't know who I really was, they only knew the version of me I allowed them to see, and for the first time in many years, I stopped trying to make them understand my worth. I simply smiled, because they had no idea what was coming next. Part 2: The daughter-in-law who took control. After that dinner, I noticed a change in my family, a change I could no longer ignore. Daniel stopped asking for my opinion. The son who once called me whenever he had a difficult decision now only called to inform me about decisions that had already been made. And every conversation seemed to have Rebecca somewhere in the background. "Rebecca thinks this is better." "Rebecca already arranged everything." "Rebecca believes you should consider this." It was as if my son was slowly disappearing behind someone else's voice. At first I tried to understand. Marriage changes people. A husband and wife build a life together. I wanted Daniel to be happy. But happiness should never require someone to erase their own family. A few weeks later, Rebecca came to my house without warning. She walked through the front door and looked around the living room. The same living room where William and I celebrated holidays. The same room where Daniel opened his first birthday gifts. the same walls that held nearly 5 decades of memories. Rebecca looked around and said, "This house is too much for one person." I smiled politely. "It's my home, Rebecca." She nodded. "I know, but sometimes people have to accept when a chapter is over." Those words stayed with me because she wasn't talking about the house. She was talking about me. She believed my chapter was finished. She believed my life had already passed its value. A few days later, Daniel called me. His voice sounded uncomfortable. "Mom, Rebecca and I have been thinking." I already knew where the conversation was going. "We think it might be better if you moved somewhere smaller." I looked around my home, the photographs, the furniture William and I chose together, the memories that filled every corner. "Did Rebecca ask you to say this?" I asked. There was a long silence, and that silence answered my question. I closed my eyes. For years I had protected Daniel from every hardship. When he failed, I encouraged him. When he struggled, I stood beside him. When he doubted himself, I reminded him of his strength. But now, the person I raised was standing on the other side. And he didn't even realize it. Rebecca became more confident with every passing day. She started telling relatives that I was having trouble managing things. She suggested that I was becoming too emotional, too old-fashioned, too attached to the past. She wasn't just trying to change my life, she was trying to change the way people saw me. And the most painful part was, people started believing her. One afternoon, my longtime neighbor Margaret Lewis came to my door. She looked worried. "Margaret, is everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" She hesitated. "Because Rebecca has been telling people that Daniel is worried about you." I looked at her carefully. What exactly did she say? Margaret lowered her voice. "She said you aren't capable of making important decisions anymore." For a moment, I said nothing. Then I looked out the window at the house I had built a life inside. The house they thought they could take away. The reputation they thought they could destroy, and I realized something. Rebecca wasn't just trying to move me out of my home. She was preparing to remove me from my own story, but what she didn't know was, I had spent my entire life preparing for moments exactly like this. And I had one thing they never expected. A secret. Part 3, they thought I had nothing left. For the first time in my life, I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending every accusation. I stopped trying to convince people that I was still capable because I finally understood something. The more I tried to prove my worth, the more power I gave them. Rebecca believed my silence meant defeat. She was wrong. My silence was a decision to watch, a decision to wait, and most importantly, a decision to remember everything. Over the next few months, Daniel and Rebecca became more comfortable treating me like someone who no longer mattered. They started making plans without asking me. They discussed my future as if I wasn't sitting in the same room. One evening, they invited me to dinner again. But this time I knew it wasn't about family, it was about business. Rebecca placed a folder on the table. I looked at it but didn't touch it. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled gently. "Something that will make life easier for everyone." I opened the folder. Inside were documents about transferring certain responsibilities and managing parts of my personal affairs. I looked at Daniel. "Did you read these papers?" He avoided my eyes. "Mom, it's just a formality." A formality. That was the word people used when they wanted you to ignore something important. I slowly closed the folder. "You want me to sign away control of my own decisions?" Rebecca immediately shook her head. "No one is taking anything from you." But her expression said something different. She wasn't asking. She was expecting. I pushed the folder back across the table. "I'm not signing this." For the first time, Rebecca's calm expression disappeared. "Margaret, you need to be realistic." I looked at her. "About what?" She leaned forward. "About your situation." There it was again, the same message, the same belief, that age had made me powerless, that losing my husband had made me weak, that living quietly meant I had nothing left. Rebecca lowered her voice. "You need to understand that Daniel and I are the ones who will have to handle everything eventually." I smiled because she had no idea how much she didn't know. For years I had allowed people to see only one side of me, the mother, the wife, the woman who supported everyone else, but before I became those things, I was someone different, someone who made decisions, someone who understood people, someone who knew how to build something from nothing. A few weeks later, I heard Rebecca telling one of her friends about me. She didn't know I was nearby. "Honestly, I feel sorry for her," Rebecca said. "She doesn't realize her best years are behind her." Her friend laughed. "At least Daniel has you now." Rebecca smiled. "Exactly, soon everything will finally be organized." Everything, that word stayed in my mind, because Rebecca wasn't talking about helping me, she was talking about replacing me. That night I sat alone in my living room. I looked at the old photographs on the wall. William and I when we were young, Daniel as a little boy, the family I had spent my life protecting. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I never thought I would ask. How long do you allow people to underestimate you before you show them the truth? The answer came quietly. Soon, because while Rebecca was celebrating a victory she hadn't earned, she didn't know that someone had been waiting for this exact moment. Someone who knew the truth, someone who had been holding onto a secret for years. Part 4: The letter my husband left behind. For months I watched my family believe they had already won. Rebecca became more confident, Daniel became more distant, and everyone around them started treating me like a woman who had lost control of her own life. But what they didn't understand was one thing: I was never powerless, I was simply patient. The day everything began to change was a quiet Tuesday morning. I was sitting in my kitchen when the phone rang. The name on the screen made me pause: Thomas Bennett. I had not heard that name in almost a year. Thomas was my husband's attorney. He had been William's closest legal advisor for more than 30 years. I answered. "Thomas." His voice was calm but serious. "Margaret, I believe it is time we had a conversation." I knew immediately something was different. "Is everything all right?" There was a brief silence. "Your husband left something behind for you." My heart stopped for a moment. "William." "Yes." I held the phone tighter. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because William specifically instructed me to wait." "Wait for what?" Thomas took a breath. "Until the day you felt that people around you no longer respected the woman you truly are." I didn't speak, because those words felt like they were written for this exact moment. Later that afternoon I met Thomas at his law office, the same office where William and I had signed important documents throughout our marriage. Thomas placed a small wooden box on the table. It was old, simple, but I recognized it immediately. "It belonged to William. He wanted you to have this when you needed it most." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the box. Inside was a handwritten letter, my husband's handwriting, the handwriting I had seen every morning for 48 years. I unfolded the paper, and the first sentence made my eyes fill with tears. "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means someone has forgotten the woman standing in front of them." I continued reading. William wrote about the years we spent together, about the sacrifices I made, about the choices I quietly helped him make. But then came the part I never expected. "The world sees me as the person who built everything, but the truth is I could never have done it without Margaret." I looked up at Thomas. "What does this mean?" Thomas opened another folder. William wanted to make sure the truth was protected. He placed the documents in front of me. For years I had allowed people to believe I was only a supportive wife, a woman standing behind the success of others, but the documents revealed something completely different. My name was connected to decisions that shaped the future of everything William built. I wasn't just someone who watched from the side. I was part of the foundation. Thomas looked at me and said, "Your husband always said the greatest mistake people make is underestimating a quiet person." I looked down at the documents. All those years, all those sacrifices, all those moments when people thought I was invisible. They weren't signs of weakness, they were proof of patience. And suddenly, everything Rebecca had done became clear. She thought she was removing an old woman from her life. She thought she was taking control from someone who had nothing left, but she never knew the truth. She never knew that the person she called a nobody was the person who had more power than anyone imagined. Part 5: The woman they never knew. The next morning I woke up feeling different, not because anything outside had changed. My house was still the same, the quiet kitchen was still the same, the photographs on the walls were still the same, but I was different. For the first time in years, I stopped seeing myself through other people's eyes. I was no longer the woman Rebecca described. I was no longer the mother Daniel had started to pity. I was Margaret Anderson, and I remembered exactly who I was. Thomas asked me a question that morning. "Margaret, what do you want to do now?" For years, my answer would have been simple: protect my family, keep the peace, avoid conflict. But this time I didn't answer immediately, because I finally understood something. Keeping peace with people who disrespect you is not peace, it is surrender. I spent the next few days reviewing the documents William left behind, and with every page I read, another piece of the truth came back. When William started his first business, people believed he was the only person responsible for its success. But they didn't know about the nights we spent planning, the risks we took together, the decisions we made when there was no guarantee we would succeed. They saw William signing contracts, they saw him shaking hands, they saw his name on the buildings. But they never saw me sitting beside him at the kitchen table at midnight, helping him think through every difficult choice. I never wanted recognition. I never needed applause. I was happy knowing the people I loved were safe. That was the woman I chose to be, but Rebecca mistook kindness for weakness, and that was her biggest mistake. A week later, Daniel came to my house. I could tell something was wrong. He walked in slowly. "Mom, can we talk?" I invited him to sit. For a few moments, neither of us said anything, then he finally spoke. "Rebecca says you met with Thomas." I looked at him. "Yes." His expression changed. "Why?" I almost smiled, because after everything that happened, he still didn't understand. "Because your father wanted me to." Daniel looked confused. "Mom, what does that mean?" I reached for the documents on the table. "Daniel, before you decide someone has nothing left, you should make sure you know their entire story." He looked at the papers but didn't touch them. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" That question hurt, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I did. Because I never wanted you to love me because of what I had. Daniel looked away, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes, not anger, not confidence, regret, but regret was not enough, not yet, because while Daniel was beginning to understand the truth, Rebecca was still convinced she was in control. She had no idea that her actions had started something she could not stop. She believed she had pushed an old woman into a corner, but she didn't realize something important. A corner is where people discover their strength. And Rebecca was about to meet the woman she never thought existed. Part 6: The Truth Changed Everything. For the first time in many years, Daniel looked at me differently, not as his aging mother, not as someone he needed to protect, but as someone he had never truly understood. And that realization hurt him, but pain was necessary, because sometimes people only see the truth after they have already caused the damage. A few days after our conversation, Daniel asked to meet me again. This time he came alone. No Rebecca, no excuses, just my son. He sat across from me quietly. "Mom, I owe you an apology." I listened, but I didn't interrupt. "I thought I was helping you," he continued, "but I was actually listening to someone who never tried to understand you." Those words were difficult to hear, not because they were wrong, because they came too late. I looked at my son, the little boy who used to hold my hand when he was afraid, the man who had forgotten who had always stood beside him. "Daniel, do you know what hurt me the most?" He looked up. "It wasn't Rebecca. It was watching you believe I had become someone who needed to be controlled." Daniel lowered his head. "I was wrong." Before I could answer, my phone rang. It was Thomas. His voice sounded serious. "Margaret, I think you need to know what Rebecca has been doing." I felt a sense of disappointment, not surprise, because deep down I already knew there was more. Thomas explained that Rebecca had been speaking with people connected to the family for months. She had been trying to create the impression that I was no longer capable of making important decisions. She wanted people to believe that Daniel needed to step in. She wasn't protecting me. She was building a case against me, a case based on lies. That evening, Thomas arranged a meeting, not just with me, with Daniel and Rebecca. When Rebecca entered the room, she looked confident, almost relaxed. She still believed she was the smartest person there. "Margaret," she said, smiling, "I hope we can finally resolve this." I looked at her calmly. "I agree." She sat down. "Good, then we can move forward." Thomas placed a folder on the table. Rebecca looked at it. "What is that?" Thomas answered, "Evidence." Her smile disappeared. Inside were records of every conversation, every document, every attempt to manipulate the situation. Rebecca's expression changed. For the first time she looked uncertain. Daniel looked at her. "Rebecca, is this true?" She immediately tried to defend herself. "You don't understand, I was only trying to help." But nobody believed her anymore, because the truth was finally sitting in the room. Not hidden, not controlled, not rewritten, just the truth. I looked at Rebecca. For months she had called me weak. She had treated my age like a disadvantage. She had forgotten one important thing. Age does not erase wisdom. Silence does not mean ignorance, and kindness does not mean someone cannot fight back. Rebecca looked at me, and for the first time she understood. The woman she tried to remove from the family was the one person she should have respected from the beginning, but the story was not over. Because every betrayal has a consequence. And Rebecca was about to discover the price of underestimating someone who had spent a lifetime building her strength quietly. Part 7: The Price of Betrayal. After the truth came out, everything changed, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly. The way people looked at Rebecca changed first. The confidence she once carried disappeared. The woman who always seemed to have the perfect answer suddenly had nothing to say. For months, Rebecca had built her reputation on one idea: that I was no longer capable, that I was someone who needed to be managed. But once the truth was revealed, everyone saw what she had really been doing. She wasn't protecting me, she was trying to replace me. Daniel struggled with that reality. He had spent years believing he was making the right choices. He thought he was being a responsible son. But now he had to accept something painful. He had allowed someone else to convince him to turn away from his own mother. One evening, Daniel came to my house again. This time he didn't bring apologies, he brought honesty. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom." I looked at him. "Some things cannot be fixed with one conversation." He nodded. "I know." The silence between us was different now, not cold, not angry, just honest. "I should have trusted you," he said. I looked at my son. "You should have listened." And that was the truth, because sometimes betrayal does not come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from people who stop seeing your value. Rebecca's consequences came quickly. People who once supported her began stepping away. Friends who had believed her stories started questioning everything. The image she worked so hard to create began falling apart, but the hardest consequence was not losing status. It was losing trust, because trust is something that cannot be demanded, it must be earned. A few months later, Rebecca asked to speak with me privately. I agreed. She sat across from me, much quieter than before. "I made mistakes," she said. "I waited. I thought you were someone standing in my way." She looked down, but I was wrong. I listened carefully, because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. "I spent years proving my worth," I told her, "and you spent months trying to take it away." She looked ashamed. I wish I could change what I did. I believed she meant it, but some wounds teach lessons that apologies cannot erase. "I hope you become a better person," I said, "but I also hope you understand something." She looked at me. "Being family does not give you permission to hurt someone." Rebecca nodded, and for the first time she had no argument, no excuse, no explanation, just silence. The same silence she once mistook for weakness, but she finally understood. My silence was never surrender, it was strength. I spent my entire life giving people second chances, but this time I chose to give myself one. A second chance to live without proving anything. A second chance to be respected. A second chance to finally choose myself. And as I watched the sunset from the porch of my home, I realized something important. The greatest victory was not seeing Rebecca lose. The greatest victory was realizing I never needed to defeat anyone. I only needed to remember who I was. Part 8: The Legacy She Left Behind. A year after everything happened, my life became quieter, but for the first time in many years, that quiet felt peaceful, not empty, not lonely, peaceful. I spent less time worrying about what people thought of me, less time trying to make others understand my choices, and more time enjoying the life I had spent decades building. The house that Rebecca once believed was a burden became the place where I found myself again. Every morning I sat by the window with my coffee. I watched the sunlight enter the room, the same room where William and I dreamed about the future, the same room where I raised Daniel, the same room where I once wondered if my own family had forgotten my value. But now I no longer asked that question, because I knew the answer. My value was never determined by how others treated me. It was always there, I just had to remember it. Daniel and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't the same as before, and I accepted that. Some things cannot return to the way they were, but they can become something new, something more honest. One afternoon, Daniel visited me. He looked around the house and smiled. I never realized how much this place meant to you. I smiled. Most people don't understand the value of something until they almost lose it. He nodded. I almost lost you. I looked at my son. Yes, you did. There was sadness in his eyes, but also growth. And sometimes that is the only thing we can hope for from the people who hurt us, that they learn, that they change, that they become better than they were before. As for Rebecca, I never forgot what happened, but I also refused to carry anger for the rest of my life. Anger gives the person who hurt you power over your future, and I had spent too many years building my life to give that power away. William once told me something I never forgot. He said, "A person's greatest achievement is not what they leave behind. It is the person they become while building it." For years I thought my legacy was the things I helped create, the memories, the sacrifices, the people I protected. But I finally understood. My greatest legacy was not something written on paper. It was the strength I found when people underestimated me. It was the courage to stand up when the people closest to me tried to make me feel small. It was the choice to respect myself when others forgot to. Today I am 75 years old, and I no longer see my age as something I need to defend. Age gave me wisdom, experience gave me patience, and every challenge gave me strength. To anyone who has ever been made to feel invisible, remember this. People may underestimate your silence, they may mistake your kindness for weakness, they may forget everything you have done, but they cannot erase who you are, because your worth was never created by their approval. It was created by everything you survived, and sometimes, the person everyone thinks has nothing left, is the person who has the most powerful story to tell. After everything that happened, I learned something important. Strength is not about how much power you have. It is about knowing your own worth, even when others try to make you forget it. I lost the trust of someone I loved. But I found something even more valuable. I found myself again. My story was never about revenge. It was about dignity, courage, and protecting the legacy my husband and I built together. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who never truly knew you. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe to DramaVerse for more powerful family stories. Remember, every story has a twist.